Hello. I'm Adam.
I'm Adrian.
And welcome to Cast from the Crypt. Today, in honor of the holiday, what are we watching, Adrian? Or what are we talking about?
1980s Friday the 13th.
The one that started it all.
Not to be confused with 2022's Friday the 13th, which is this Friday. I guess the day this will be uploaded.
Yeah. I thought the first Friday the 13th is the most fitting one, too, because yesterday was Mother's Day as of recording. So why not have the one we talk
I
about
love
be the
that.
one about the mother?
I love that. I mean, she is a dedicated mother. Also, spoiler warning right off the gate.
Spoiler
Right out the
warning, but
gate, excuse me.
also,
Yeah, if you haven't seen it.
come on.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I agree. Um, yeah, happy Mother's Day, happy Friday the 13th, where you get to talk about this classic movie that I actually enjoy, but not nearly as much as I do the rest of the franchise. So I'm actually kind of interested in talking about it.
Really? Okay. I mean, I agree. I think the rest of the franchise is probably funner because with all these slasher movies, especially these 80s ones, especially Friday the 13th, they are the Jason movies. You know, Halloween is the Michael Myers movies. They're about these villains that you love. And this movie doesn't have Jason in it. You know, it is his mother. So it's missing the guy you come for to the franchise for.
Yeah, that's true. Or, never mind. This is sort of an anomaly in the horror movie world, right? Because there are people that are still under the misconception that Jason is the killer in all of the movies. In fact, there are many people that are still under that misconception. But no, it's his mom in the first movie, and you really only get a glimpse of him at the end. Um, and even then, I'm not entirely sure if they were expecting Jason to become what he became, right?
It's really interesting if you watch all the movies of this franchise in order. Just how Jason evolves throughout the years. In this movie, it feels like they didn't really know who he was yet. He is at the ending. He's just this, zombie kid that shows up just like as a final jump scare, and he doesn't serve any other purpose than a final jump scare. And then in the second movie, he's like demented hillbilly. He's like that stereotype, deformed, demented hillbilly. And then after that movie is when he gets his iconic mask, and that's when they begin to play with the idea of maybe he's undead. He's at least like unkillable, but it's still ambiguous. And then later on, it's okay, he's a zombie. He's a zombie Jason. You take his mask off, and there's worms in his face. But it took some time for Jason to become Jason. In every other slasher franchise, the slasher you come for, the main villain, is fully thought of like right out the gate. That's who the movies are about. But Jason took some time to become Jason.
No, he did. And honestly, I think that the franchise is stronger for it just because there are so many entries in this franchise and they are hit or miss largely. I think anybody will tell you that. That being said, um, each film has its fans and each film has its following. And I think it's because the plot is just all over the place and there are so many different things for so many different types of people in this franchise that it just works. Um, yeah, similar to Nightmare on Elm Street, right? That each movie is just so different that there's something for everyone in these franchises.
Yeah, I think with these movies, it is like, what do you imagine Jason as? Like in your mind, in your head canon? And there's probably a movie where he's best represented as that. Like I think the fifth or sixth entry is where you get him literally coming back from the grave. They dig him up and he comes back to life. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that's your favorite version of Jason.
Zombie Jason,
Yeah, Zombie Jason.
but
The
Jason
Yeah,
Lives. That's
Jason
my
lives.
favorite Jason,
Yeah.
where he's like electrocuted and comes back to life, and he's got maggots in his skull.
Yeah, I think I like I don't know. I like it when he's a bit more designing and he's like a hunter. So maybe even in the remake, although I don't, it feels kind of cheap for me to cite Michael Bay remake Jason as my favorite Jason, but I don't know.
Hey,
I like that depiction.
I defend the Michael Bay Friday the 13th
Oh,
quite
you
a
know
bit.
I do too.
I mean, I think it's a really fun movie, but this is not that. This is incredibly far from it, and I like this movie. Um, but I think the franchise ended up improving.
I absolutely agree. I think most people do too. Um, this movie, I don't know when it first came out, but it's not the most well received film critically. And I think that's a little harsh because, like, all right, it does have problems. It's not the best film ever. It's not even the best film in the franchise, but it started it. It was the genesis of not even the Friday the 13th franchise, but just so much of what we come to know as a slasher today. And it is not given enough credit for that, I don't think.
Yeah. No, I agree.
There's also this, like, what rewatching it, I was realizing there's this great aspect of, like, kind of who done it. You don't know who the killer is. You have no clue who it is the whole movie. You don't even know if it's Jason. Like, when I watched it for the first time, I thought, okay, maybe it's Jason, but that's with the hindsight of 20 plus years of this franchise when I first watched it. Uh, when you in 1980, when this movie first came out and you were watching this, you probably had no clue who the killer was. You were probably squirming the whole movie trying to figure out who's killing people.
Well, yeah, and the shock, the twist of it being a mother that is so engulfed in grief and anger that she goes on a killing spree is very interesting. But also, uh, I could be wrong, but like I'm pretty sure it must have been pretty unusual to see a woman as the killer in 1980, right? When this first came out. Like I feel like that was a big reveal as well.
That is just another thing that's another aspect to the unassuming, like, look about Mrs. Voorhees. You first see her and she's wearing like a sweater. She's literally just cute camp counselor mom. You so don't suspect her to be capable of any evil, and then she's the killer. And she's not an established character in this movie until, like, right before they reveal her to be the killer. Yet even when they do that, you still don't think it's her because of how unassuming she is. Happy Mother's Day.
Yeah, happy Mother's Day. No, but it's true, right? She's like in a cozy sweater at the end of the movie, and she's just this smaller. I mean, I don't know. I She does have like a sinister look to her, but um, she doesn't scream mass murderer.
No, she looks like this is probably how my grandma looked in the 80s.
Right, right, exactly. So no, they did a good job of making Miss Voorhees look like a every woman. Do you want to get into the plot a little bit?
Sure, but I wasn't gonna go crazy heavy into the
No, no,
plot
I
just
agree. I
because,
think we can just.
yeah, it's known. So of course the plot, in the most simplistic way I could say it, is camp counselors show up to this camp that's been closed because of a series of unfortunate events in its past. They try to open it again. They're getting it prepared for uh, it to be functioning again. They're making repairs to these old, grounds and everything, and then slowly they start getting picked off one by one, until there's only one final girl left. And this is the movie that began slashing on a summer camp and had that final girl. I mean, it ticks off every classic slasher box. And if you want to go more detail, I know that was general, but
Well, yeah, I mean, um you've got the eerie wooded battlefield, as it were, or location where all the gore happens. You've got the incredibly non-diverse, just kind of aloof cast of uh, young camp counselors who are just incredibly, uh, I guess we should say, horny.
Yeah, yeah,
I mean, I don't
exactly.
know how
Yeah.
else to say it. Uh, and it makes for an entertaining hour and a half, or really, I think more specifically, 95 minutes. Um, because they just are so unassuming and cannot combat what is coming after them. And so it's kill after kill after kill. And of course, we do have a final girl, and that's where our kind of expectations are subverted. And I imagine they were really subverted in 1980, uh, because we have just an incredible ending to the bloodshed in this movie. Um, Mrs. Voorhees, of course, gets beheaded, and it's just spectacular.
What does she get
So
beheaded? It's by that machete too,
it's
isn't
by
it?
the machete. Yeah, yeah, it's by the
Yeah.
machete. You get a slow, gross shot of like the nub.
It's it's dramatic. Like our final girl Alice, who's like, you know, she's the tiny victim. She's not supposed to be physically imposing or anything like that. Yeah, she in one swing just chops the head off of Mrs. Voorhees, and maybe the most ridiculous looking kill in the movie. But what a dramatic period punctuation to this film.
Yeah, no, it's great. And then, of course, they throw you another curveball at the end with the surprise Jason scene. There's a lot of really good stuff in this movie. It's a bona fide classic, and when you're watching it, there's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. Does that make sense? You understand.
Yeah, I think so too. And I mean, the tropes in it are so recognizable at this point, but I am giving this movie maybe a little bit more credit than it's due, but it is one of the earliest examples of these tropes. Like, you have the cast of teens or young people. You've got like the goofy jerk guy, the innocent and kind of shy final girl. You've got a couple that are warming up to each other and then eventually having sex and getting killed during or after the sex. And this movie too, you don't think about it, but it also is the first instance of the machete being the weapon of choice for this franchise, which I think is interesting that the machete becomes um more iconic to the franchise before Jason himself does.
Yeah, that's true.
I thought that was interesting. That's something I hadn't really thought about before.
Me neither. And I did notice that this movie, the mythology of the machete, right? Like
Yeah, I
it
know.
having been wielded by his mother and used to kill her, it adds a whole nother level to Jason's character because everybody knows Kruger's got the claws, Voorhees has the machete. Um, but you really do have to watch the first installment to see why he's so fixated on that weapon. And Jason's no stranger to other weapons, right? He is obviously huge into using his environment. He throws people face first into trees and uses the uh, spiky ends of metal fences as spears. But when you think Jason, when you buy a shirt with Jason on it, when you're playing the video game, right, the weapon is the machete. Everybody knows that.
As you have done plenty of times. Are you wearing that shirt now?
No,
Are you going to wear it on
but
Friday at least?
I am gonna wear it on Friday.
Okay, good. Yeah, fantastic franchise. It's funny you mention Freddy Krueger too because I just watched Jason versus or Freddy versus Jason.
And that's a ridiculous movie. But it's great because, as I was saying before, really, I think the only two franchises that have feature length films for every type of person are those. Um, I think Halloween, there are some ubiquitously known duds, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Um, but with these two franchises, they're just so um, they're just so popular, and again, the sheer volume of the movies, the sheer size of these franchises ensure that, again, I don't want to repeat myself too much, but there's really something for everybody here. I know that you and I have clear favorites, but we could probably agree and disagree all day about, you know, which movies are the strongest in either franchise. So yeah, I don't know. I love Friday the 13th for that. I also just think that its production history is super interesting.
Yeah, do you want to get a bit into that? Let me. This movie is absolutely a B movie too. So for every, goofy beheading or bad effect or, you know, strange bit of dialogue, like you do have to give it leeway for that. The budget for this movie was $550,000, which is not much. Really not much. Um
Yeah, no, not particularly. This movie was produced and directed by Sean Cunningham, or his professional name is Sean S. Cunningham. But he's a guy that, had done a lot in horror already at this point. Like he had worked with Wes Craven and had done, I believe, Last House on the Left, and also was just a huge John Carpenter fan. Loved Halloween, and all of that shows in this first installment of the movie. But um, he took a chance offering to do this movie, and one of my favorite stories from it is Variety magazine, which still obviously publishes stories on all sorts of media to this day, had put out an ad for Friday the 13th. And the ad, it's the broken glass, like cold open logo that they show in the movie as well. But the top of the poster says, the most terrifying film ever made. And at that point, they hadn't actually even had a script when the ad was placed in Variety. So people were looking forward to this movie before there was even a screenplay. Um, and the screenplay for Friday the 13th was a long, arduous development process. Um, it was completely called a different thing. Uh, I don't quite recall what the script was originally called, but um, it was Cunningham who decided to change the name, and that's when they reworked the script. Um, and that's shortly after that they got that ad in Variety that I was talking about. And it's just kind of crazy to think that such a monumental release in the horror genre started from such humble beginnings and had, just a small $500,000 budget.
Before this movie, too, like just to speak to the impact, Friday the 13th has always been like an unlucky day. The number 13 is unlucky, of course. And I guess Friday the 13th was too, it was like, oh, it's Friday the 13th. But now, in my lifetime and yours, Friday the 13th is unlucky because of these movies, because that's when Jason kills people.
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah, for sure.
and like we're so far removed from like the origins of that phrase. It's like, oh, I guess this was a thing before this movie, but now it is unanimous with the movie. And that's the impact this movie had. I mean,
Well, and what's funny is I actually had to look up why Friday the 13th is considered unlucky.
oh, absolutely, me too.
Um, just because I don't associate that with real bad luck. I just associate it with this film franchise. For anybody that doesn't know, uh, why the 13th is considered unlucky, I believe it's really only because 13 is like a universal sign of bad luck and superstition. Um, on the Gregorian calendar, at least. So, all this to say, there's many different meanings in many different cultures. There's like an entire like Nordic reasoning behind it. Even it's crazy. But if you're American, you're thinking Friday the 13th. You're thinking this movie franchise.
Even at this point, like it's unanimous. Like, veering off track a little bit here, but there's like it was kind of like a niche Cockney term to be like, oh, he's stranger than a Clockwork Orange. And now, if you say a Clockwork Orange, you will only think of the book or movie. Like, that
And let's be
phrase
honest,
doesn't exist anymore because this piece of media has eclipsed it.
another fun fact about the production of this movie. Um, what I'm just going to ask you this. I'm not going to lead you at all where I want you to go. This will happen organically, okay? What is the most famous scene in this movie?
Oh, I would definitely say Miss Voorhees talking to herself in Jason's voice saying, kill her, mommy, kill her.
Okay, fair enough.
Is
What
that
is
not what you wanted me to say?
no? What is another very famous scene in this movie?
Kevin Bacon getting an arrow through his neck.
That is also true.
There's a lot of
What do you
famous.
think left audiences
Oh,
aghast
easily
again?
the final scene where Jason jumps out of the water and grabs.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. That's where I wanted you to go.
I always think of kill her, mommy, kill her when I think of this movie.
That's very fair, and I should have known that that's where you're going to go. But uh, did you know that this movie didn't end that way in the final draft?
Really?
Yeah, it literally just ended with like the beheading, cut to Alice in the water, dead.
Why would she be dead?
Well, exactly. So it was Tom Savini, who we've talked about, I believe, on
Our
the show before.
beloved.
Yes, we love Tom Savini, very famous makeup designer, special effects guy. It was him that was like, we have to do the cliffhanger ending with Jason coming out of the water. A quote from Tom Savini about the ending, which again was his proposition, was the whole reason for the cliffhanger at the end was I had just seen Carrie, so we thought that we need a chair jumper like that. And I said, let's bring in Jason. And that's what he told the producers, the directors, and or rather Sean S. Cunningham. And he gave us one of the most famous horror movie endings of all time.
Wow. And that what a
I know.
quote. Let's bring in Jason. Because, like, if that doesn't sum up the rest of the franchise.
Exactly. Exactly. Um, so no, I love it.
Yeah, wow. I mean, the ending, too, though, like, I think it's easy to criticize that ending. Because it is kind of like, okay, what does this mean? What's going on? Like, it really doesn't make any sense. And then she wakes up and it wasn't even real, I think, in the second movie. And it's. It's kind of like,
Yeah.
oh, okay, he's a zombie child. And then in the second movie, like he's not a zombie and he's not a child, and I. But whatever, whatever. Who cares? What an iconic ending.
No, I agree. And the kills in this movie, though they don't look great, are just as iconic. And that, of course, is the work as well of Tom Savini, who would only go on to really improve upon his craft because these effects aren't fantastic compared to his entire body of work, but um, he did go on to do not just part one, but he worked all the way through part four, and you can see his development in this franchise alone, which I love and appreciate. Um, because again, the evolution of Jason alone is just something that's so interesting and riveting about this franchise.
Yeah, well, it's also think back to the budget. Like there was no budget. Like what they had to work with is impressive. Like it doesn't look the best at a lot of times, but it's still pretty good. It's pretty convincing, especially like imagine you're watching this in 1980. It might very well be the scariest movie you've ever seen. Um,
Yeah,
People are horrified of this movie.
yeah. I mean, I remember I was just a little kid, like forever ago, and my sister had friends over, and this was the scary movie they picked, and they were horrified of it, you know. And she was younger. I mean, I guess high school aged, but nonetheless, like this is still an effective horror movie to many people. You and I, we're desensitized, but there are a lot of people that I think this would scare. Um, and rightfully so, right? I mean, the whole thing is that you have eight relatively young people running for their lives against a completely anonymous killer. It's a scary situation. Um, and I have to credit all of that to the folks that worked on the casting, which are Julie Hughes and Barry Moss. The acting in this movie is not good, but there is something to be said for the, I don't know, the wide-eyed, not innocence, but um, again, aloofness that these characters brought to their roles, or rather, these actors brought to their characters. Uh, that makes every kill just feel hardcore and sinister.
Yeah, I guess I agree with that. I mean, as much as they're like, I don't know, you all these slasher franchises, you have nameless cannon fodder, you get slashed and move on killers, and that's exactly what these characters are. They're tropey cannon fodder, but they feel a little bit higher quality, you know.
Yeah,
And one of them is Kevin Bacon, to be fair.
yeah. One of them is Kevin Bacon. Also, like some of them had already acted. Like several of them were child actors and worked in soap operas. Like Adrian King had worked in soap operas before this. Um, but they were just looking for generic, young-looking actors. Because I don't think any of them were actually the age they play. Like they play high school kids, but I'm pretty sure that most of them were
Oh,
19, 20, 21,
I could
or
bet money
older.
on that.
Yeah. Um, well, I mean, I know a few of them were a
The,
fair bit older than their actual characters.
they have this character Steve, who supposedly like he's the guy who bought the camp and hired all the quote unquote teenage camp counselors, but like he looks the same age as all of them, and he's supposed to be older, but like I think the only difference is he has a mustache.
Yeah, he has a mustache and like a John Denver hair.
Yeah, and some booty shorts,
Yeah, those things are
some
ridiculous.
short jorts.
Um, uh, I mean, for the most part, like I think the casting is fine for what it is. It is weird seeing Kevin Bacon in this because he's obviously had such a fantastic career and has gone on to do so much, whereas most of these other folks, I don't think do much of anything anymore. They probably go to horror conventions twice a year and make money off of this movie still. So, which no hate, right? Like that's a great thing, but it is kind of funny seeing such an esteemed actor in this movie.
Yeah, I mean that's how I feel every time I watch Nightmare on Elm Street and I see Johnny Depp in it.
Johnny Depp, or seeing Lawrence Fishburne in the second movie as well.
The third movie.
Oh, excuse me, the third movie. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
three
it's
more.
always like, wow, they're in this movie.
Yeah,
Well, think of how much Johnny Depp cost back in those days versus now.
I mean, he
You
was
know?
probably nearly free back then.
Yeah. I don't know. We normally talk about the kills, but I've talked about these kills so many times in my
Yeah.
life.
And I don't think there's a need to really like.
Yeah, they're good. You know, Kevin Bacon getting throated with, that arrow is really cool. That's my favorite kill, I think. Um, Everything else is whatever. I want to talk about Ralph the crazy guy though,
Go.
because he's the most ludicrous part of this movie. So there's at the beginning of the movie and like throughout the first part of the movie, this the local loony, the crazy guy. His name's Ralph, and he looks like he's Amish, maybe, or like from many hundreds of years ago. And he just goes around saying, "Don't go to Camp Blood. You'll get killed there." And at one point, he shows up on the camp, And he's like, I am the messenger of God. You need to run away before you get killed. They don't explain him. They don't know why. Like, why is he obsessed with the killings? He's like an old man, like too old to have been at the camp when the killings happened initially. He has no backstory and no explanation. Um, and then they find him later. Like they open a cupboard and he's in the cupboard. And like, was he just waiting in the cupboard for someone to open the door so he could tell them to leave the camp? He's very
Yeah.
unnecessary. I wish they'd bring him back or expand on him more or something, but they don't do that.
No, no, and I kind of understand why they didn't.
I understand why
Um,
they didn't, but why include him?
that does bring me to, or that brings us rather into a nice spot to talk about the critical response to this movie because this movie has become beloved and we call it a classic, but it was not popular when it came out. Like LA Times pooped all over it and called it boring and basically immature and people the musical score for Friday the 13th is now also beloved and uh people didn't take too kindly to that either
When you
back
say
in the day.
people, do
Well
you mean
specifically, oh no. Specifically, there's one report I read that LA Times called it a nervous musical score, which I think is funny.
you say
Or
people,
maybe
but you mean critics?
critics are people.
I mean, I'm saying the general reception. The critical reception and then the general audiences are two very different things.
That's true.
If
That's
everybody
true.
hated this movie, it would not be huge like it is today.
Well, but I don't know. Considering we've seen some movies that become incredibly popular after the fact.
Yeah, but I don't think this is like a cult following. I think this is like it's Friday the 13th, you know?
Yeah, I suppose you're right. The critics were not fond of it.
I think it's always so interesting how radically the critical reception always.
Contrast from like audience opinion.
Yeah. Yeah, it's always so huge and usually I think it's a bad thing, but in this instance it's a very good thing. I'm glad.
There's that range like on Rotten Tomatoes for any horror movie nowadays. I know that if it's like below 30%, it's probably just going to be boring. But if it's like 30 to 60%, there's some gold there. And I know that Friday the 13th has like a 63%
Yeah,
last I
perfect.
checked, which, yeah, is like gold standard for this kind of horror movie.
Yeah, well, that's another thing about like the critical reception of this movie. Okay, let's analyze this film. Okay, sure, it's not the greatest, but you can take pleasure and enjoyment and entertainment from terrible films. And for a slasher movie like this, you're not really gonna be expecting Shawshank Redemption. You want to just see people get slashed. That's the whole point. That's all the enjoyment. That's why all these movies were made and this franchise is so successful. It's just because it's fun to cringe and pull the covers over your eyes. When there's a great gruesome kill or like I don't know. It's that like the shock of it all. I guess it's just somehow so alluring.
Yeah, for sure. Well, and this is my favorite horror movie franchise of all time. Um, and it's because of its just bombastic nature, the things that it pulls out of nowhere in each installment. It's just they were able to do something new pretty much every time. Even at the end when it was dying, with like Jason Goes to Hell, Jason X, uh, it's really good at again. I feel like I've used this term 100 times already today, but like subverting audience expectations, spicing things up.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, in the later franchises, it's like, okay, we take Jason and he goes to hell. He goes to space. He fights Freddy Krueger's. You just put him in new situations, and it's so great to watch. It's always fun, even if it's terrible.
And as an origin story for Jason, I think this movie does its job, right? Because the truth of the matter is, this franchise outgrew its first entry. And, we're sitting here reviewing the first movie and like not talking about Pamela at all, but it's because this is the setup for what becomes just a really good, solid horror franchise. And it does a good job of setting it up. It intrigues you. And Savini's proposed ending, I think, is kind of what makes it really effective as an origin story, right? Because if Jason wasn't even there, we might have had some confusion. This movie might not be what it is today, uh, if not for that proposed ending.
Yeah, introduce Jason. Here he is. I like to look at this whole movie as just like hyping up the arrival of Jason. Like this whole movie is the lore, is the drum roll before the rest of the franchise.
Yeah,
Yeah, classic movie. I'm so glad. I've seen this movie a million and one times in
I
my
have
life.
two.
Yeah.
I have two, and it doesn't really get old.
No, it really doesn't.
It's nice. It's refreshing in comparison because I had told you I wanted to cover uh, either Jason X or Jason Lives because they're the most dynamic. I would say personally. Again, what I think is lovely is that many people will disagree with me in that regard. But I find them to be, some of the most exciting movies in the franchise. But you were right. We talk about those movies all the time. What we never really look at is this one. And it's a run of the mill slasher in every sense of the word. But again, it's such an integral piece to this franchise and an enjoyable one at that too. Like I think it's worth watching it.
Yeah. Also, screw Sleepaway Camp. I'll say it.
Sleepaway Camp sucks.
It's Sleepaway Camp is this movie if Tom Savini never said introduce Jason.
Yeah. No, Sleepaway Camp is not a movie I enjoy. It's the poor man's Friday the 13th.
Yeah.
And that's okay. I'm okay with saying that out loud. And I just can't imagine something being a creator, right? And like starting something having such me creating something having such humble origins and then it becomes so much larger than it was ever intended to. That's always incredibly fascinating to me when it happens. And uh it's like what you said about the superstitions or just about what this franchise became and probably still is. I'm sure in our lifetime another movie will be made because that's just how this is.
Oh yeah, and
It's
I
just
look
how it
forward to
works.
it.
Yeah, me too.
Especially with
Um,
this, like we've seen kind of a resurgence of these classic slasher movies in recent years.
yeah,
So I'm just waiting.
yeah, exactly. Uh, and I'm waiting eagerly too.
Yeah, yeah.
I don't know if you can stream these anywhere. I think that's worth mentioning.
I don't think you can as I mean as of right now. We always say where to
And for
stream
free.
things, but
You can of course rent them.
yeah, all this happens in everything with streaming changes every like 3 months anyway. So,
Right, right.
uh,
Yeah, you never know. Who knows? Actually, they might be on like Paramount Plus, and I don't even know it. But
yeah, but somebody has this movie on CD or even VHS. So,
yeah, and if somebody doesn't, there is a half price books down the road where you can get a DVD of it. I bought the Blu-ray box set years ago for like $10 on sale at a Walmart, so it's out there, and that's how I watched it.
all right. Well, thank you for joining me, Adrian. Happy Mother's Day and happy Friday the 13th.
Mm, fantastic.
Thank you,
Thanks, buddy.
everybody. Yeah, thank you and thank everybody for listening. And